Behind me is a painting by someone named George Caleb Bingham. Who lived in the mid 19th century, mostly in Missouri, and it's called The County Election. It was executed in 1852. Um, I chose this because this lecture presentation is about the rise of what used to be called Jacksonian democracy, but which historians more in recent decades have called the white man's democracy because, when you think about it, this particular democracy excluded women, excluded African Americans, and so it was a democracy as long as you were a white male. Otherwise, not so much. So it's all So truth in advertising. Better to say white man's democracy rather than a Jacksonian democracy. Now, if you look in this painting, there's a few things that I want to point out to you. Uh, the first here is are a couple of guys that are getting rollicking drunk, and this at this particular county election, because these were very public affairs, no secret ballot. Everybody knew how you were voting. There was a kind of a celebratory element to it that Bingham obviously captured. If you look here, you see three men, presumably discussing the issues of the day, maybe not. Um, Up here, you see a man taking an oath. That's this fellow there. He's actually an Irishman, and he's taking an oath to the effect that he hasn't voted before. Back during this period, um, there was there were no immigration laws. Open borders. People could come in as they liked. During this period, you had a lot of Irish, you had a lot of Germans, and um, and they could begin to vote quite early on. And there was just things varied from one state to another, and there are all kinds of irregularities and so forth. But this was part of this early era of democracy. And then let's see, I can't quite find it, but um, there is. Oh, here it is. It's right there. That is a man who is basically passed out drunk, and a political operative, nonetheless, is physically carrying him, to the ballot box so he can cast a ballot for, whatever party the operative has to deal with, probably the Democratic, party. So, this is what democracy looked like early on, and what we're going to be exploring, today is how the United States went from being a republic to a democracy. And that doesn't mean that the United States ceased to be a republic. It just means that the the political culture changed from the limited voting that the founders had in mind to to the democratic kind of voting. Lots, just about everybody was a white male getting being able to vote. That frankly the founders had grave misgivings about. So let me share the screen with you. Here we go. Here are the key terms. And then let's go on to this business of going from republic to democracy. You know, how did this come about? Well, to begin with, the founders contemplated a republic in which the right to vote and to hold public office would be restricted to educated, economically independent property owners. It was their conception of what we would now call high information voters. So these were people that, in their view, had a strong stake in the republic, had the ability to understand the issues, had the ability to vote intelligently, and everybody else they had grave doubts about. So they basically didn't trust common men to vote. Common men were less educated, they weren't economically independent, and so this fit, the founders' conception of what we would now call low information voters. And the history of republics showed the danger of democracy in the form of the danger of demagogues. And these were political leaders who appealed to the emotions and prejudices of ordinary people rather than the use of rational argument. If you were a property owner, if you were educated and so forth, you were responsive to rational argument. If you weren't, you could be easily swayed, you know, by appeals to your emotions, sort of usually whipping up your fear of the other party. And if this sounds, familiar, politicians playing upon your emotions, particularly your fear of the other side. They're always trying to, in advertisements, politicians typically go negative. They attack the other candidates, they attack the others because it works. Being positive, like, here I am, and here's my happy family, my children, and so forth, and these are the wonderful things that I plan to do when I take office. That will only get you so far. People tend to vote in line with what they are afraid of, and politicians know that, and they play upon this. And of course, this involves emotions. And I wouldn't say that present day politicians are demagogues. I'd say some are, but but they all, but the political culture that we have today really corresponds to exactly what the founders had misgivings about. So the key question is, well, why do you get this broadening of you know, political participation? And and this is sort of a fascinating story, because these basic patterns of political behavior began to change after the War of 1812. At the same time that there were new economic patterns, we call it the market revolution, and these two intersected. So we'll be dealing with the rise of democracy this week and the market revolution in detail next week. But to get this upsurge in voter participation in state elections, in local elections, white men flocked to the polls in numbers larger than ever before. In some states, up to 90% of eligible voters voted in elections. And that is, much higher than the number of voters who participate in present day elections, even presidential elections, where the turnout is the highest. So, okay, why did this happen? Well, one thing you have is the growing acceptance of Jeffersonian ideas about the problems of aristocratic governments and the political importance of the people. You Thomas Jefferson and his political allies, in what now what call the Democrat Republican, party, um, were more comfortable with the idea of political participation by more or less, ordinary Americans. Now, Jefferson did have some reservations. At one point, he proposed to give, um, you know, men 40 acres of land, to give them the economic independence that was considered to be a sine qua non, for the ability to participate in elections in a way that didn't have you under the thrall of an employer. So you have this. You have a greater comfort with with the people. Then you have the decline of the Federalist Party's point of view that the people were incapable of making sound political decisions. Then you also have the consolidation and acceptance of political parties in the sense that we understand political parties today, and the acceptance of the idea of a loyal opposition party that could benefit politically from the mistakes of the party in power. So, you lose this sort of spirit of faction, that the Federalists, must be, from a Jeffersonian perspective, must be like, willfully wrong in their approach to government, and the Federalist perception that the Jeffersonians would be willfully wrong in their ideas about what was best for for the republic. And what you get now is that you got two perfectly legitimate political parties that just happen to disagree on the issues. That's simplifying things quite a bit, but it gives you something of the idea. Next, more and more political officials were elected rather than appointed. And this happens at all levels, local level, Counties, you have someone running for dog catcher, postmaster, and this kind of a thing. Um, and so, that means that you're pushing down the level at which people are voting because, when you're in local elections, you don't want to have just a few people voting. You want to have, ordinary people voting. And as more judges and other office holders were chosen by the people, politicians were forced to campaign uh, more because they were dependent on the votes of common people, and they had to compete with others for those votes. And so voting thus became a way for regular people to articulate their choices and opinions, and not just a duty that good citizens, did for the republic if they were allowed to vote. So you have that. Then, and this is really crucial, you have a new dominance of economic questions in politics, and this relates very closely to the market revolution. Now, a lot of the decisions, that you're going to be make have to do with the party that you think is going to give you, you know, the best stake in life, the best economic advantage. And the different parties, had very different, different ideas about things. One party was a party sort of entrepreneurs, of employers, of independent businessmen, and another party appealed to those who were laborers. And so obviously these people had contrasting ideas of, what they wanted, the kind of economic system they wanted, and the role that they wanted government to play. And so um, and this is also important because this market economy went through cycles of boom and bust. One of the things that you'll see in the American Yawp is something called the Panic of 1837, and this was what we would now call a depression. And it was just basically a terrible failure of the financial system. And this failure of the financial system, in turn, had to do with failures of government policy at both the state and federal level. So various groups thought that they had the answers to the economy's problems. And again, farmers favored a return to a simpler economic system and were anxious to vote for those who held that point of view. Entrepreneurs, again, wanted more government aid and protection for their ventures and wanted to vote in support of that point of view. And one of the things that entrepreneurs really wanted were something called general incorporation laws. Nowadays, if you want to protect yourself from going personally bankrupt, like losing everything that you've got, losing your house, all this kind of a thing, what you do is you incorporate. Um, and that protects you. If your business goes down, then the assets of the business, go off to your creditors and so forth, and that kind of sucks. But you're personally protected against that. These general corporation laws that we take for granted now were something new in those days. And again, if you were an entrepreneur and so forth, you wanted to vote for aspiring state office holders who were in favor of these general incorporation laws. So you have that. Then you have more and more states that were starting to grant universal white male suffrage. Um, and this meant that any white man could vote, as long as they were 21 years or older. By the way, it's not until 1972 that a constitutional amendment gets passed to allow 18 people who are 18 years old to vote. That's a relatively new development. And these, white males could now vote regardless of whether they own property, whether they made a certain amount of money, or paid a certain amount of taxes. All of those qualifications, sort of went by the board. And so more and more white men, therefore, were able to vote. And since they were increasingly likely to see voting as important, you know, they did so. I mean, nowadays, there is a sense that, if you are in a congressional district that is gerrymandered so that it is solidly Republican or solidly Democratic, one of these is you're not really going to vote very much. Is, when it comes to your congressperson, your vote just doesn't count. But and then sometimes you feel like there's no real difference between the parties, or neither party has policies that are going to affect your life in a positive kind of way. Well, in in the early 19th century, around the 1820s and so forth, people believed that their vote did matter, that who they voted for did matter, that there were policies that they supported and there were the policies that they opposed, you know, and sort of dragons to slay. And so this is something that not only could more men go to the polls, but they wanted to go to the polls. They had a strong incentive to do that. So you have that. Then you also have, and this is more importantly, really, an overall social leveling was beginning to take place. In the colonial era, there was a sense of hierarchy. You had sort of the better sort, the middling sort, and the lower sort. Well, the egalitarian spirit unleashed by the revolution tended to flatten these distinctions. And now, if you were wealthy, you didn't get the deference of people who were below you. They just thought you were a snob, um, and so that it could work to your disadvantage. And so, you know, fewer and fewer people were likely, as the 19th century wore on, to assume that the rich and the well-born should be treated with special respect or were a natural aristocracy who are the people who should, sort of automatically be looked to hold public office. And inherited social status and a clearly defined upper class, just began to disappear in some ways. Also, it was easier for self-made men to rise to positions of leadership and prominence. And we're going to see, one such person in the form of Andrew Jackson in just a few minutes. And so, and these aristocratic, pretensions in a country that now you've got self-made men who are becoming, who are sort of pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps and becoming wealthy, you know, um, increasingly they're just impatient with people who come from money and come from wealthy families and so forth. They're less likely to defer to those people and more likely to assert their own opinions. Well, I mentioned high voter turnout. This is what we're looking at. 1824, you get a voter turnout of 26.9%. That's pretty pathetic. 1828, that election, 57.6%. It goes up 80.2% in 1840. And from then on, it stays pretty high. In fact, the highest it's 1860, the crucial election in which the choice of presidential candidate really was going to determine whether the Deep South was going to remain in the Union or was going to secede. And the election of Abraham Lincoln, of course, caused um, a crisis in which the Deep South did secede. So obviously the stakes were very high in 1860, and so voter turnout was especially high in that election. But you're looking at these elections, and by and large, from 1840 on, you're looking at higher voter turnout than we get in present day presidential elections, even though now also the development of what has been called the second party system was central to this development. The first party system consisted of the Federalist Party and the Democrat Republican or Jeffersonian party. But the second political party system consisted of parties that were good at mobilizing voters. And it wasn't so much that you had a lot of independent voters and swing voters and this kind of thing. You had your base, and the and what what these parties were good at was just like mobilizing their base and bringing them out en masse. Every now and again, you had sort of people switching from one party to the other, but people tend to be pretty loyal to their party. So it's a matter of mobilizing their base, and political parties got to be very good at that. Now, in terms of this emergence of the second party system, well, the Federalist Party essentially self-destructed after the War of 1812. From the beginning of the war to the end, it steadfastly opposed the war, voted against declaring war on Great Britain, voted against military appropriations, Their strength was mostly in the Northeast, where the United States was hoping to invade Canada. They didn't cooperate with that. Um, by 1814, they met with something called the Hartford Convention. That was kind of an anti-war affair. We'll get into the details of that. But when the war ended, and strictly speaking, it ended in a stalemate. It was called, what happened was you kind of returned to what was called the status quo antebellum. Well, that's how things turned out from a rational perspective, but from an emotional perspective, the United States had held its own against Great Britain in what amounted to a second war for independence, and the Federalists had been were just sort of cut out of this thing. They were against the war, and the war had worked out well, and so they were toast. um, so for several years the United States actually had only one political party, and the Democratic Republican James Monroe handily defeated, his Federalist opponent, such as it was in the election of 1816, and in 1820 ran virtually unopposed. You had like, a minor person here and a minor person there and so forth, but he got practically all the electoral votes. But this did not mean that presidential elections continued to be uncontested. In 1824, and we're looking at the 1804 election right here, four Democratic Republicans ran for president. And this was possible because political parties in the modern sense, were just beginning to emerge. You didn't have the convention system. You didn't have political parties nominating just one person, for to hold office. In this instance, you had, four candidates throwing their hat into the ring. Now, if you look at Andrew Jackson, he got 153,000 votes. He won the popular vote, no problem, but nobody won a majority in the Electoral College. And under the Constitution, what happens in that situation is the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives to adjudicate, to determine a winner. Um, and this had happened for the second time in 24 years. The election of 1800 was like this. Well, Henry Clay, you know, he didn't do all that great. In fact, he was not quite dead last in the popular vote, but he was a good politician. He had good connections, well networked and so forth. And of the three possibilities, this William H. Crawford was out, um, because he didn't get enough of votes, which left Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and he himself. Well, he wasn't going to get to be president, so it was a choice between choosing Jackson or choosing John Quincy Adams. Well, he backed John Quincy Adams. This enraged Andrew Jackson, who believed that he should be the president. And he was further enraged when John Quincy Adams appointed Clay to be his Secretary of State. And back in those days, Secretary of State was considered to be kind of a springboard for the presidency. And Jackson snarled about a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. Now, the fact of the matter is, Clay was a very capable man and a capable Secretary of State, and there probably wasn't there wasn't a corrupt bargain. But you know, Jackson was the kind of guy who was perfectly willing to believe that there was a corrupt bargain, and it made him really, really, really mad. Well, in 1828, Jackson and John Quincy Adams squared off directly. It was just the two of them. And here in the map, it's called Andrew Jackson as being a Democrat and John Quincy Adams as being a national Republican. That's a little bit anachronistic because the Democratic Party, as such, emerges a bit later. But they were a study in contrast. Um, John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, president. He was highly educated. He was cosmopolitan when his father was ambassador, and he was ambassador to several European countries. Quincy Adams had gone with his father and saw a lot of Europe and was multilingual, and he was really he was a member um, of the elite. Well, Jackson was very different than that. This is a painting of Jackson, actually taken in 1845, same year that he died. But it gives you a sense of Jackson's power. His sort of his persona, which was just incredibly forceful and commanding and in a way charismatic. And he was just somebody you didn't want to mess with. He was somebody you didn't want to mess with literally because he had a reputation for having fought like dozens of duels, you know, pistols at dawn kind of thing against people that ticked him off. In fact, we know that he was a party to only two duels, but in one of them, he shot his opponent to death. You know, so killing people not a problem for Jackson. His origins are so obscure that we're not sure whether he was born in South Carolina or North Carolina. He was right on the border. We know that his parents were immigrants from Ireland, if I'm not mistaken. His formal education, unlike Adams, was limited. He became a lawyer, but in those days, you didn't go to law school. You got with somebody who was an established attorney, and you read law. In effect, the senior attorney, you were an apprentice to the senior attorney, and then you became a lawyer on your own, and you could begin to take cases and so forth. The American Bar Association didn't exist, yet it was a matter of hanging out your shingle and so forth. And Jackson did that for a little bit. As a young man, he moved to Tennessee, and Tennessee was up and coming. It had been part of North Carolina, during the colonial era, but now it was its own state. But it was just beginning to develop economically and politically, and opportunities, in Tennessee abounded. And he rapidly rose to economic success, partly through land speculation and partly through slave trading. He was a slave trader. He purchased his first slave when he was 21 years old. And at the time of his death, he owned 150 slaves. And I'm going to call them slaves in this context because this is the way Jackson saw them as chattel property. In other terms, we would think of them as human beings who were enslaved. But this is just not the way that Jackson viewed things. At age 34, Jackson became a colonel in the Tennessee militia, and he thereafter became a general in both the Tennessee militia and also the U.S. Army. During the War of 1812, he fought two very important battles. The first was against a faction of the Creek Indians, also called the Muskogee Indians, in a battle at Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, in which he basically destroyed that force, and that was a major step in ending the ability of Native Americans to hold on to their lands east of the Mississippi River. Then in January 1815, he defeated a British army that was making an attempt to capture New Orleans. Now, this particular battle occurred in January 1815, I think January 15th, 1815, and it actually occurred, about 3 weeks or so after the treaty ending the war had been signed in Ghent, what is present day Belgium, and nobody had the word yet, and so this was a major battle that that in effect the British and the Americans didn't need to fight, but they did. It was a resounding American victory. It made Jackson a national hero, and this his military victories, and particularly his victory at New Orleans, really established him as as a potentially major political figure. So um, by the time he ran for president, he was a wealthy man. He was prominent in society. But nevertheless, Jackson, came from humble beginnings, and he cultivated an image as a common man. Now, to some extent, you know, he felt like a common man. He had common origins, this stuck with him, for his entire life. But at the same time, I think he understood that, you know, given this emerging democratic spirit, given that ordinary, white men were now able to vote and they were common men, that that his ability to come across as a common man was a major political um, asset. So Jackson defeated John Quincy Adams without a lot of trouble. And on the day of his inauguration, 21,000 people showed up at his inauguration at the Capitol. Afterward, everyone, all 21,000 people, was invited to come to a reception at the White House, what was then called the Executive Mansion. And this is what you're looking at here. You look at all these people, you know, and the Executive Mansion itself was filled with these people even before Jackson arrived on horseback from his inaugural ceremony. Now, Jackson himself left soon afterward, but the crowd remained. And there was a lot of booze around, and they drank heavily, and became ultimately just a drunken mob. They broke several $1,000s worth of china, and they took strips of upholstery and other items as souvenirs. But this raucous reception underscored the point that Jackson was a man of the people. And he never lost that popularity. And it was a major tool by which he was able to fend off elites who tried to curb his power. And Jackson exercised presidential power more forcefully than any of his predecessors.